The Atelier is a non-for-profit organization, art school, and gallery offering professional and personalized instructions for artists of all levels. Today, we're joined by artist and instructor Randall DiGiuseppe presenting Lady Liberty Ed Hopper's Muse.
Yes, I'm on. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this extremely frigid northeast evening. Temperatures are in the teens. It's a good time to look at, well, a survey that I've put together of one of my favorite artists and probably my favorite American artist of all time, Edward Hopper. You might notice the title, Lady Liberty, Edward Hopper's Muse. Like Edward Hopper's work, the name is ambiguous. A lot of Ed Hopper's works, and there were many. He was a very prolific artist. He had well over 300 paintings, and his complete catalog totals over 800 pieces altogether. That's including the 300 plus paintings and etchings and watercolors and drawings. And rather than overwhelm you with a smorgasbord of works, considering a man as prolific as Hopper is, I wanted to, well, pare it down. It's one of the challenges of a talk like this is that when somebody creates so many works, what do we talk about? And what this survey is going to be about are some of his most influential works during his life that were directly inspired by the neighborhood he lived in Greenwich Village, specifically the West Village of New York City. Many of these masterpieces were created merely, well, or rather were inspired within blocks of his own home. So this is something I'm looking forward to sharing with you. So if you just sit down and enjoy the ride, we're going to take a look at some of Ed Hopper's most intimate works. It's funny looking back of it now. I was thinking that I would probably change the name of the survey, but I was pressured to come up with something quickly. So I hope you enjoy it. What we're looking at here is a self-portrait of Mr. Hopper that was done circa 1925, 1930. Enjoy it while it lasts, because, well, for starters, of his catalog of 300 plus paintings, maybe less than a handful are in the portrait format. In fact, all of them, the vast majority, over 99% of his paintings are in the landscape format, meaning they're horizontal orientations. He's done very few self-portraits over the years, but this one is his most popular. You might notice it, the palette being what it is. He doesn't use a lot of black. He uses a lot of spectral colors in this, and it's available to view in the permanent collection at the Whitney Museum of Modern Art on the West Village. I like to break this lecture down into 3 parts so that we're not completely overwhelmed by the amount of work. And again, forgive me if it seems a bit dense, but I did the best I can to pare down what I'm going to be discussing today. So the first part, we're going to go through a brief survey of his early life and his progenitor pieces that influence his more mature works. I tend to think that it's not fair to an artist when we tend to consolidate their entire body of work as a singular opus when there is a chronology involved. And I'm going to, to the best of my ability, share in the chronology and the evolution of his work from his very young age, and how special people in his life influenced him, and how the trajectory of his career changed his style and made him the artist who we've come to adore today. So we're going to take a brief tour of his early life, look at his early works, and then we're going to get into his growth period, and then his maturity, and then ultimate decline and plateau, and then his legacy. So part 2, after a 5-minute break, will be Mr. Hopper's Neighborhood, the prime years. We'll take a 5-minute break. And after that, we'll be going from pinnacle to plateau to legacy. And I'll leave all questions and all Q&A for the remainder of the lecture at the end for reasons of time management. So we'll be looking at works such as, well, some of you are familiar from this paintings, whether you follow art history or not. It's very popular in pop culture. Nighthawks. We'll be taking an in-depth dive into this painting. We're also going to be looking at the most recent painting that was making the news, Chop Suey. So these are his more recognizable masterpieces. And then this painting here, early Sunday morning, where that's my wife in the way, right in the middle there, enjoying this masterpiece at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And I promise I have some images without her in front of the painting, but since she was there, I actually rather enjoy this picture and figured I'd share that with you. Man of the hour, Edward Hopper. We're going to be taking a deeper dive. This is a photo that was taken circa 1940s. So he was 30s, 1930s, 1940s. Call them fun facts, but oh, that's relative. Starting from the very beginning, Ed Hopper was born in the West Bank suburb of New York called Nyack. It's at the time it had a population of just under 2,000. It wasn't a highly populated port town. It's probably prior to Ed Hopper. It's probably most popular because it was mentioned. Most people don't know about Nyack unless because it was mentioned in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's a town across from Sleepy Hollow, across from the Hudson River. Bear in mind, when we look at Ed Hopper's work, we tend to see him as a child of the Jazz Age, but when he was born at a very, very different time. 1882, there was no electricity. That most of the transportation was by horse and buggy or walking. There was a train system, the Erie Railroad that took you from Nyack to Erie, Pennsylvania, but there was no direct line to New York City except by boat or ferry down the Hudson. Nyack is approximately 30 miles. Here's Nyack up here, separated by the Tappan Zee Bridge that didn't come around until the 1950s, but as there would be a quick sail, 30 miles down to Manhattan Island, take you about 3 hours by sail, depending on the wind, or 3 hours by steamboat. So this was the geography of where Mr. Hopper was raised. Quiet little river port town in Nyack. His parents were, he came from a merchant family, dry goods merchants. His home is 1 block from the river. In fact, it is a museum now and a landmark. The Edward Hopper House, where he grew up, was roughly a block from the river. You can actually see the river from here. It's actually a pretty neat place to visit. And if you're interested in visiting, that is the website down there. This is in Nyack. That's the edwardhopperhouse.org. He lived there until his teens. He took the drawing at a very early age. And what was interesting was, well, I'm going to show you the earliest work that he did. This is Edward with his older sister, Marion, who was 2 years his senior. The earliest pictures recently discovered, not too long ago. This was this little ink drawing that he did on the back of his 3rd grade report card at the age of 9. Not bad. But I want you to think about, even at the age of 9, you start seeing some of the things that were strong in as style and sensibilities. I mean, you'll notice in a lot of his works, many of his works, the backs of his subjects are turned. Something to consider in the future. We're going to look back on this later. It was his father, Mr. and Mrs. Hopper. They were very erudite. They took, from what we understand, they were not strangers to New York City. They would go down there to enjoy the theater and cultural events. And they encouraged Edward's creative side. And they noticed that he had a very strong tilt towards the artistic. His father was very bookish, as some would say, and his mother encouraged him to pursue his artistic endeavors. He realized, and this is him when he was a young man, as a teenager. I should point out that he started realizing pretty early on that he was just born to be an artist, and it was a calling. He had the passion, he had the talent, and he just had the head for it. And his parents, unlike a lot of people in his demographic, did not discourage him from pursuing his artistic endeavors. In fact, they encouraged it, but it did come with some conditions that we'll talk about later. He was the artist for his high school newspaper. Here's some sketches he did for There's some studies early on. This is from his circa 1890s. He was still a teenager. I should point out that when he was 13, he had a massive growth spurt. He talked about how he was highly uncomfortable and very sore, but he grew nearly a foot in 1 year. So by the time he was age 14, he was well over 6 feet tall, and he was a pretty hard guy to miss, which made him a target of well, ridicule and bullying and being made fun of. He was a gentle giant and shy by nature, and he was an introvert. He was not the bullying type, but by the time he was a mature male, he was over 6'5". Now, I should point out that his parents did support his calling to become an artist, but it did come with some conditions. They would support his artistic studies at the New York School of Art, providing that he pursue commercial illustration as a backup. They would support him as an artist, but they also pointed out that it's a difficult life and they weren't going to subsidize the career, but they would support his endeavor. This is a self-portrait he did as a teenager and young man, probably in his late 20s. Excuse me, late teens, early 20s. Not entirely sure when, but quick sketch that he did. But yes, in 1900, he left Nyack, took that either ferry ride or took the ferry across to Sleepy Hollow and took the train down to Manhattan and enrolled in the New York School of Art under the tutelage of William Merritt Chase and Robert Henri, who were two classical painters, very popular masters even today. Their ties are very close. Well, galvanized in the Art Students League. In fact, these are self-portraits of both artists, so you can get an idea of what ilk he was studying under. So it was a classical tilt early on. There's no question that Edward was learning at the League, where they taught along at the other institution downtown. Says Robert Henri, William Merritt Chase. They were his two principal instructors while he was also learning commercial illustration. And here's a very early portrait of him in his early 20s under their tutelage. And you can see, well, a couple of things. For starters, in comparison to the previous one, very, very classical style. He's very locked in the classical technique and the classical palette, very brown, dour background. He's also very young. He also has a huge coif of hair there, which I guess he started balding in his late 20s, early 30s, and that's how we know him and are most familiar with that look. While he was studying in New York, he took 3 trips to Paris to study the masters there, and his parents supported this as well. That also came with conditions. Well, while he went to study in Paris, and this was during the time that Pablo Picasso, a young Picasso, who was pretty much the same age as Hopper at the time, along with his friends Matisse and Mogliani and that ilk, were painting the town red and sowing their wild oats, so to speak. Edward was having none of that. His parents sent him to Paris, but he was going to be living with a commune of nuns who were constantly chaperoning him. So he did enjoy Paris a great deal. He thought it was one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and he thought that the locals had a very strong appreciation for beauty. So he learned a lot, absorbed a lot with the museums there. He also had his heart broken. I won't get into that too much. That's a story for another lecture. But ultimately, you would see very early on these little seedlings of Hopper's style. So this is a very early oil paint study along the Seine River in Paris. And this is circa 1900, if you can imagine. And you can see a couple of the traits in Hopper's style. Very sparse detail. He was averse to clutter in his paintings. He was also averse to clutter in his life. He was not a hoarder by any means. His wife Josephine Nivison said that he was just repulsed by clutter, and he does that in his paintings. He omits a great deal, so something to consider moving forward. In 1908, he moves to New York City permanently. New York becomes his permanent home, and he tries to cut his teeth in the fine art world, and it proves to be a challenge, especially in the early stages of his career. He's doing commercial illustration, which he despises, but it puts food on the table. In 1913, at the Armory Show, he sells his very first painting, this painting here, Sailing, which is presently at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's interesting because he had this strong urban tilt very early on. He did have a passion for sailing. It might be because he did a lot of it, sailing and rowing in the Hudson River off the riverbank of Nyack. And it's something he enjoyed for the rest of his life. But with everything he was exploring, it was ironic that the one painting that did sell at the Armory was this 1911 painting of sailing, the sailing scene. And this is an important thing to point out because he thought things were on the up and up. He thought the trajectory was going nowhere but up. In 1913, his very first official sale at the Armory, he would not sell another painting for over 10 years. So things got really lean pretty quick. He was pretty much relegated to commercial illustration and tightening up his belt. One of the things he did too, and this is a very special picture for me, he moves from a studio. Initially, when he came back to New York, he was on 59th Street and 3rd Avenue. He went down to Greenwich Village, specifically the West Village, and he rented an apartment. It's 3 Washington Square North. The building's still there. It's a national landmark. It is now the Office of Social Work for New York University. But here's the entrance, if you can see with my pointer. It is a 3-floor walk-up. That would be his studio up here. The bathroom was in the hall. The sole source of heat was a coal fire stove, and they were not permitted to store coal upstairs. So every time he wanted to heat his apartment, he'd have to go up 75 stairs and down 75 stairs down to the stairwell where the coal was stored. So this is going to be a pivotal moment in his life, this station where he completely assimilates into the West Village lifestyle. So here's a map. I got this off of Google Earth. So as you can see, the house is right here. The apartment is here. It faces south over Washington Square Park, 5th Avenue, University Place. New York University has since assimilated all these into their property. But the overall topography has changed. Well, the topography is fine. It's just that the skyline has changed quite a bit around. But many of the masterpieces we're going to be looking at were only a stone's throw from where he grew up. This is the studio itself on the 3rd floor. Again, it's available to view in person if you ever get to go. I think it's free of charge. You'll notice that it's an enormous easel facing south. That's the view outside. That heavy tree line is facing south towards the Washington Square Park. You'll notice there's a printer, a printing press over here. He would explore printmaking to sustain, well, to just remind himself that he was a fine artist when he was doing commercial illustration. That's him later in life, in 2 years before he died. I should point out that he was in this apartment from 1913 until the last years of his life, 1967. He lived there for well over 52 years. I could not imagine going up and down those stairs every single day. But he did. He loved it. He didn't care what anybody thought. In fact, that apartment building housed a lot of famous artists in his day. The great Thomas Eakins lived in that building at one point. I believed George Bellows, or what's the other one? His name escapes me, but there have been other artists that have lived in that building. Not the best in terms of amenities, but that's a nice light source there. All right, so I'm going to show you some of the very early work some of you may not be familiar with, but you can start seeing little bits of Hopper's style, that economic use of form and space. Not a lot of clutter. And I called them the seedlings. And you'll see these hints later on. So this is a very early painting that he did before he moved into the apartment. This is when he lived on 59th and 3rd. This is Blackwell's Island. This is actually, if you look off to the left here, you would not know this unless it was mentioned to you, but that is the Queensboro Bridge, now known as the Ed Koch Bridge, facing west. This is the east side of Midtown Manhattan, looking over to Blackwell's Island, this strip of land over here. And on the other side would be modern-day Long Island City, and then on the horizon would be, well, Nassau County, Long Island, Queens. In typical Hopper fashion, it bears mentioning that he was averse to the grandiose. He never painted the Statue of Liberty or the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building, Grand Central Station. None of those interested him. He was into more intimate focal points of the city. These areas less traveled, I guess, visually. So from here, I'm not entirely sure what his vantage point is, whether it was imaginative or whether it was from his studio, but could have been very well from the bridge itself, looking over from a sketch. Here's a little tugboat. You could swear by looking at this, the moon is being obscured, but it's being shown over here by this torrential water in the East River. For those not familiar, the East River is actually not a river at all. It's a tidal strait. It's actually a part of the Atlantic Ocean, but it's so narrow they call it a river. Very torrential waters, very, very dangerous to fall into, very fast waters, which explains all this torrent right here that creates this illusion. You notice in typical Hopper fashion, the absence of people, just the slight hint of people as it cuts across here. Blackwell's Island right here is actually, it became what was originally a hog farm island, and then it became a place where there was a hospital and an asylum, later called Welfare Island, and then in the late 60s, late 50s, early 60s, it was renamed Roosevelt Island. So this is the interesting vantage point. But this interesting thing about this to me is that there's very little depiction of the most grandiose thing there, which is the Queensboro Bridge. He did paint it earlier on when he came back from Paris, and then he just became allergic to all things grandiose. He said that he was repulsed by the vertical, and that's going to play a huge role as we start moving forward. So keep this in mind when we start looking forward. That, I mean, when you really look at this, I mean, it's almost like a slightly horizontal Rothko, all these vertical components with this little oblique dash here. Very abstract. This could very well be, it may as well be the coast off of Nyack looking over to Tarrytown, the Tappan Zee. There's like really no hint that there's a city here at all. This is a very important painting, in my opinion. Saloon. And he called it later, he actually mentions in it, in a note to an art critic, that he considers this one of the best pre-1930s, 1940s paintings he ever did. It's a progenitor to a lot of the masterworks. The Corner Saloon, which no longer exists. They assumed it was First Avenue in the 20s. So in this scene, Hopper has this infatuation with wedge-shaped corners, meaning that these sharp angle corners that don't meet at right angles, but acute angles, like the Flatiron Building and others. So you'll notice that the corner goes around here. So you look at a couple of things that you'll see in Hopper's pieces that are echoed. Lampposts, these two-story brownstone brick and mortar structures, and then this sharp angled wedge block. Oh, and then on top of everything else, the little cockeyed barber pole over here. It should be pointed out, we're not entirely sure what this is about and what they're waiting for. Looks like they might be online over here, waiting for something on the other side. And in typical Ed Hopper fashion, we don't know what any of this is. It looks like a newsstand. And it's safe to say that among all of Ed Hopper's works, this may be the most crowded piece and the most highly populated piece in his catalog. So we'll be coming back to that. Another piece that he did a little later on in 1921, his soon-to-be wife, Josephine Nivison, is the model here. There's a voyeurist component to this. He mentions when he walks through the streets of New York, quite often you can't help that you see people just kind of living their lives and you get kind of fixated. So this is the view here, believe it or not, of New York interiors from outside in a window with this woman, what seems to be hemming either her dress or some fabric over her lap. Clearly not aware of who's behind her and who's viewing her. There's no drape on this window. Strong vertical components. Again, remember that very, very first drawing we saw when he was very young, at 8 years old, with the back of the subject to the viewer. And that's going to be something that is going to be an echoing motif in a lot of his paintings. This painting is viewable at the Whitney Museum. It's part of the permanent collection, if you're ever interested in seeing it. And yeah, so what we're looking at here is a woman that seems to be hemming a dress, completely unaware of who's viewing her through the window. There might be some component of a male companion that lives there, or a male presence. It's like a male hat and a piece of fabric here. Might be a coat that was thrown. Could be very well hers. Again, in typical Hopper fashion, we don't know. We do know what time it is, which is either, well, it looks like it's midnight. It's very dark outside and it's lit inside. And bear in mind, the idea electricity was a relatively new thing. It wasn't completely of 100% in New York City in the early 1900s, late teens. So in 1921, this is actually a rather novel idea. And think about the life that Hopper lived before he came here. One thing I should point out is you'll notice that that printing press that he had in his house. One of the ways he sustained himself when times were lean in his apartment in Greenwich Village was he created etchings. He would sell them. He just found a more feasible way of selling his own art while keeping his sanity while he was doing commercial illustration, which again he loathed. And it got so bad that he was actually going door to door, trying to get some people involved in hiring him. In a lot of ways, if you look at this, this is like a bird's eye view in the evening, creating this rather surrealist light. This could very well, it looks very much like it could be the saloon that he painted in 1911, 10 years earlier. This other sense of this wedge corner could be very, very well the same building. Hard to tell. But he's showing his artistic chops, his fascination with drastic angles and lines and contrasts of light and shadow. You don't see a lot of Hopper figures animated as well. Quite often they're pretty static. So it's something to consider as well. We also see another print here, night shadows, probably taken from his notes in the daytime in Washington Square Park, right across the street from where he lived. A very, very surreal scene, very unusual. There's always a sense of uneasiness and tension, even when the lights on. But here we have an individual in the middle of the night. I'm assuming Washington Square Park, reading a newspaper by lamplight, completely oblivious to the surroundings. Should point out that when he made these etchings, he sold them at $10 to $15 a piece. They were rather lukewarm sales early on. And as we move on, we'll see how these sharp oblique angles in composition will affect him later on in his more mature works, which would lead to his magnum opus. And I think this would be a good time to take 5 minutes before we start exploring his later work. So it's 7:29 now. Let's resume. Well, it's now 7:30. So this would be a good time to, I believe, take a break. So we'll be back in 5. And if you have any questions, you can set them aside. I won't answer them until the end of the lecture, but I think this would be a good place to take a break. Whoops. Hey, all right, and we're back for part two of our talk. Now we're going to be exploring his artistic development beyond his early stage. So think about those early pieces and how they're going to be affecting his work later on. This particular poster or this painting I put up here, New York Pavements, is strange in a lot of ways. It's very un-Hopper-like in some ways, very illustrative, almost looks like a book illustration. Chrysler Museum of Art. I have to say, no, I just find this very curious because it's very un-Hopper-esque. You have like this nurse slash nun is pushing this. It's almost like she's photo bombing this painting or painting bombing the paintings. Comes in the middle, disrupts the architecture, pushing this carriage with an obscured baby. There's a lot again. You whenever you look at Ed Hopper's work, there's always more questions than answers. And I should point out that this is the only painting in all of Ed Hopper's catalog where he depicts a child. Everything's adults, and they're usually small groups. So there you are. New York Pavements. It's viewable in the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk. Part two. This is what looking back, this is what I should have named the entire lecture, because again, I'm trying to keep this reined in on works of art that were specific to his surrounding environment where he lived in New York City. So, Mr. Hopper's neighborhood, which was the West Village of New York and the surrounding neighborhoods that were a stone's throw from there. This particular piece, called From Williamsburg Bridge, was done a little later on. I threw that in here. I just found it a fascinating piece because it shows a lot of where Hopper's sensibilities were, and how he can take a city of 1.6 million people and make it look like it was hit by a neutron bomb. It's strange, but if you were to rely solely on Ed Hopper's paintings to describe New York City, you can swear there was never a structure that was more than 5 stories tall, and there were more than 3 people in any building. So you can actually see this view of this building as you go down the facing north on the Williamsburg Bridge. This is Delancey Street, I believe. And I find this a rather curious piece. I just wanted to show you this because I didn't plan on talking about it. It was just going to be a bumper between breaks. I just found it interesting that among all these windows, you have this one character, this one person sitting off to the side, not even staring out the window, but looking off to the left. And it had strong echoes to me of the character here in a city street in Delft by Vermeer. Now there have been, and there are. One wonders whether he saw this painting when he was in Europe, because he didn't just spend his time in Paris. He went to the Netherlands and looked at some of the work there as well. And Vermeer was an artist that was on the up and up. And some would argue that Vermeer may have had a stronger influence on him than his contemporaries, because to be honest, he didn't seem all that concerned about Picasso and the surrealists and the cubists and the abstract expressionists and the reductivists. Ed was just Ed. He was an introvert. He was alone. He was a loner. He was the kind of guy that would hang out by the bean dip at a party and just wait for the music to end so he can go home. And it's interesting to see how he prioritizes what he sees. So just to point out, when you look at these, so there's that little character here. These characters turn away. So I see these kind of parallels here. That's just me. Again, this is just my interpretation. This actually still exists. There's a picture of this image here. So this building is over here. This is a composite. He said that all of his landscapes are composites. So if you try to rein in any specific block as, oh, that's exactly something he painted, he'll tell you that nothing could have been farther from the truth, that everything was an amalgam of experiences whenever he made a piece. Just going back to the Vermeer, there are a lot of discussions about whether Vermeer and Ed Hopper were kindred spirits, and they were to some extent. There's some art, you see some similarities in their work. a lot of interiors with individual females lost in their own thoughts, very, very sparse landscapes, and a lot of mystery. And some even argue that the voyeuristic undertones of both painters. A lot of times you look at these settings and they almost seem like you walked in on a scene that you weren't meant to see, like well, this painting for starters, right? New York interior, she doesn't seem to be an active participant in the dialogue between the viewer and the model. 1923 becomes a pivotal year for Ed Hopper. Remember, the last time he sold a fine art painting was in 1913. So 10 years had passed, and he's still plugging away, doing illustration, hating his job, wondering whether he made the right decision or not. But this is a point where he meets, well, he courts somebody that he'd known years prior as a teenager, Josephine Nivison, who was a huge influence on his life. So much so they, well, after 1923, they married the year after. She was an independent, free spirit, bohemian, she was self-reliant. She was a teacher. She was an artist on the up and up, and she had some artistic influence. She also studied at the New York School of Art and also taught on the weekends. She was a rising star in the art world, and in a lot of ways, she freed up Edward. And they would paint side by side when they would leave town, and they reconnected in 1923. Now, bear in mind, we lose sight of the fact of just how old Edward is at this point. They get married in this year. Josephine spends a lot of her time while Edward's struggling, supporting him and helping him get his career up on track. She has a lot of contacts. She makes sure that he is involved in group shows, and she puts a good word in everywhere she can about his work while she's working on her stuff. They would ultimately get married. Here's the happy couple in seems to be one of the typical New England trips, maybe Gloucester, maybe upstate. It has well, the light kind of gives me a hint that it's New England. Edward and Josephine, they would stay married their entire life. There was a lot of ups and a lot of downs, and the ups were really good and the downs were really not good. We're going to discuss a lot of that as we move forward. 1924 is a huge year. That's the year he gets married to Josephine. It's also the year where he has, thanks to Josephine, a solo watercolor show, the Frank Rain Gallery in New York City. Remember, Josephine was the one with the artistic contact. She was the one from New York. She knew everybody. And this is where Ed's career really starts to take off. He has a watercolor show that is a huge financial and critical success. Frank Rain Gallery decides to take Edward on as a rep. They want to represent him. They want to showcase his work, and this is a huge boon for him. He no longer has to rely on commercial illustration, and this is all thanks to Josephine. Unfortunately, Ed does not repay in kind. It's one of the interesting, turbulent topics in their marriage. As Hopper's career is starting to take off, Josephine's is starting to flag. Remember, they both married in their 40s. I should backpedal a little bit, getting back to the similarities between Vermeer and Hopper. Aside from the handful of stylistic sensibilities, that's pretty much where their similarities end. Vermeer died at age 45, I believe, or 43. I've got to look back. I failed to remember at the moment, but it was in his mid-40s. Ed would live to be 85 years old, just shy of his 86th birthday. Vermeer has right now 31 paintings attributed to him that are confirmed. Hopper has well over 300 paintings attributed to him. Vermeer had over 14 children when he was married, and Hopper and Joe had no children. They both had no students either. Ed never took on students, and I don't think he ever taught either. This particular watercolor is fascinating because, again, this is one of the rare times where he paints a structure. This is the Manhattan Bridge. Was not entirely sure if this. I don't think it was part of that Frank Rame show, but one of those rare cases where he draws this structure that's considered grandiose. And some argue the reason why he took a shine to the Manhattan Bridge is it may have it may have given him some nostalgic appeal because it was of the Beaux-Arts tradition, like the Eiffel Tower in France. And he thought France was just the most beautiful city he'd ever been to. That being said, he said that New York was the city he knew best and liked the most. So after 1924, he starts to get traction. His works start to sell. He's getting representation. And then his relationship with Josephine is starting to fray a little bit because she's starting to gain, well, she's starting to harbor some resentment towards him. He's very needy and he's very demanding. And she sets aside, well, you can see the happy couple here. A lot can be said from this photo. You get it. So Ed seems to be lost in his own thoughts, a bit, a bit salty, and Josephine has her arms around him. This is an interesting shot too, because Josephine was a very, very short, compact woman, very, very different to Ed, almost a yin to his yang. She was a very talkative, spoke off the collar, said exactly what was on her mind, had a short fuse. Ed was again shy, introverted, and did not like conflict, but he didn't seem to have any issues having conflicts with her. They had some real doozies between them with domestic arguments, and sometimes they would get physical, according to the journals. There was a lot of that back and forth, but they loved each other, they hated each other, but they were never indifferent to each other, and they needed each other. And ultimately, Josephine saw that, well, she felt that her calling was to see that Edward's work was facilitated, and that his career was managed. So she managed the books, and she kept him in the loop with the Rain Gallery and the Whitney Art Club, and this would play a huge role moving forward. This is the studio upstairs on the third floor of 3 Washington Square. That's facing north. Should point out that Josephine was also a very jealous type. She did not like Edward painting any female models aside from her. That's her posing in this interesting setting. The setting is actually, this was painted in the studio that they lived in. And I find it a very curious painting because it's called 11 a.m. She's looking out completely naked except for the shoes she's wearing. Now, we're not entirely sure whether she just woke up, whether she's going to sleep, whether she took her clothes off, whether she's putting them on. It's the middle of the day for the most part, and she's completely naked, staring out into the most populous city in the world, not seeming all that interested in whether anybody sees her or not. I mean, she's right up against the windowsill with a very bright southern exposure light hitting her. Beautiful painting. Love the hair and the way the light catches her body. And the way she's just pondering. This again, you could see some of the Vermeer undertones that people are talking about. Again, this is all speculation. One can only wonder whether he saw Vermeer in Europe, and he could have seen them in New York as well. There were 5 that were available at the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the time. So this is a very early shot. It's interesting that he did he did all of his paintings in his studio. He did very few paintings. From what we can tell, there's only one painting he did looking outside the window of his studio. So this is a view from the ground from a studio. You can see that Washington Square Park was always very crowded, very convivial, lots of activity. Even in the middle of the night, there was always something going on. Even to this day, there's always something hustling and bustling. And that wasn't much different back when Edward and Joe were living there. And of all the paintings he decides to paint of Washington Square Park, this is the one that survives. This is rather stark, dour depiction. No tree. He removes the tree the tree line, removes all the people, removes the cars, removes all the activity, and has a very subdued, dark palette. So this is a very strange painting. It's in the Whitney Museum collection. They usually bring it out during retrospectives. I don't know if I like this painting or not. I do find it curious that you had that fantastic view outside your window for nearly 50 years, and this is what you came up with. And again, he just kind of pushes all of the skyscrapers to the wayside. He's not concerned with any of that. He's interested in the church more than anything else. Some of these buildings still stand. The church is still there. All the architecture of the park is still. This tree is still there, by the way. If you go to the Ed Hopper's studio, you can check it out. Here's a comparison of modern day and Hopper's image. Again, this economy, he removes the clutter. It's one of the things he is strange. He's like Hopper had this interesting way of looking at New York. As New York would be great if there weren't so many people. He was also very intimate and selfish with his views. Here's a view of roofs of Washington Square. Very strange piece. This is a summer in the city, the very hot, hazy summer, and he wants to show a view of New York that almost nobody gets except for a very small handful. Maybe like the tenants that live in the building that he lives in and a handful of maintenance workers that get to go up there. Roofs are by and large pretty uncomfortable. This is a very strange work as well for him because it's with Ed's aversion to claustrophobic scenes. It seems very, very well crowded with all those smokestacks. All of this here from the coal stove pipes and the bathroom vents and the radiators. It's extremely hot and uncomfortable and probably smelly and dirty up there, but it's a very unique setting. And some argue that this view is still, well, this is what it still looks like up there. He omits an entire skyline off to the right when you face west. There were more buildings than were being depicted in 1926, but I wanted to show this rare image that he did have this interest in strange affinity for rooftops, because I think that it was a view of New York that most people didn't get to see. And I remember because when I lived in the New York apartment buildings, it was almost a treat to be up on the roof, as dingy as it could be. I, for one, give an example. And when I lived in Elmhurst, Queens as a teenager, all the tenants during the 1986 World Series, games 6 and 7, when the Mets were playing, we can see Shea Stadium from the roof of our building and the glow. And we go out there in the freezing cold and we had a party and a barbecue grill on the top. We're listening to it on the radio and watching it on a TV that somebody brought up there. And it looked a lot like this, but it was a very, very unique moment in my life. I'll always remember that. I guess I share that with Ed, this interesting experience of being on the rooftop of a building in Manhattan. Another image later on, Ed and Joe, probably not in their house because there's more furniture than there is. Because bear in mind that the apartment that they lived in was sparse. And couple things to point out too. Again, as one of the things that Edward did not appreciate about Josephine, and Josephine didn't appreciate with Ed, is that you have to remember he grew up in a traditional household. Women were in the kitchen, men went out and were the breadwinners. So there was a lot of confusion as far as the roles between the two. But she was not that type. In fact, Ed liked to eat. He was a big guy. Food was a big thing for him. Joe hated to cook, didn't like cooking, didn't know how to cook. Her idea of cooking was a can of beans that she would just heat up on the coal stove until Ed, she gave him two choices on the menu, take it or leave it. And quite often he left it, and he spent a lot of time in restaurants. And this would be a huge influence on his work as well, as he would go out to get himself something to eat, because there was often nothing that he could eat at home, because Joe wasn't going to cook it for him and he didn't know how to cook. He'd go out, he'd pick up something on his own. And one of the things that made this marriage work as well is Josephine understood the artistic sensibility and the demands on the lifestyle. So Ed was a very frugal guy, and Josephine was of that same ilk, and they shared that. So there wasn't any she wasn't like, oh, take me to the Hamptons to hang out with some rich buddies, or we should just spend a bunch of money on and just paint the town red. Neither one of them felt that way. But that being said, Edwards had to eat. So he spent a lot of time walking outside of a studio, and within a stone's throw along Broadway was the automat. And for those of you unfamiliar with an automat, An Automat was the first fast food chain in the United States. They had a few in Philadelphia, but they had a lot of them in New York. Large cafeterias. Not only were they fast food, but if you look over here, there were these booths where you would put a nickel or a dime in, and there was an entire army of cooks on the other side, and you would just select the food that you would see in the booth, put your coin in. Here's a good example. Here's a good picture from the 1930s. So you can see the Art Deco. I love the Art Deco font. I was actually in an Automat. Kind of ages me. I was in an Automat twice. Once years ago in Manhattan, and later on, before the last one was shut down on Broadway when I was in high school in the late 80s. But this is how the arrangement was. You can see it's a bustling, popular area where people can actually grab a hot meal with dessert and choices for, well, for very little money. Now, take a good look at this happy group of people as they're enjoying their Automat meal. This is taken in the 1920s of this couple who were about to eat. There was coffee, pies, an embarrassment of riches, if you may, or not so rich. You can see all the little coin deposits. You turn the dial, open up, and grab your food while it be recooked. There'd be some meal would be replacing whatever was taken out. This is interesting because this leads to one of my favorite paintings by Edward, which is Automat. Now look at that painting and think about what we saw earlier. And this is, again, Edward just shoehorning his view of the world into this painting. All of that commotion, all of that activity, all of that mechanical genius just completely distilled to this scene. It's very interesting. You have this 1927 single woman, attractive, seemingly available. Not sure if she's waiting for somebody or whether she's by herself there. It's late at night because it's pitch black outside. And it's an interesting scene because there's no food. She's just drinking a cup of coffee. She's wearing a mink top, a short skirt, a low neckline, a lot of makeup. And while she's nursing this coffee and staring off over our shoulder, where all of this activity we know is happening, but he shows none of it. What he does show, oddly enough, are these very unique lights, this row of lights. So he shows this painting Automat, but there's not an Automat anywhere. But what he does that's so ingenious is that he shows the reflection in the window. Very Velasquez, like it reminds you of Los Menenos a little bit. You see the reflection of the king and queen in the portrait over the shoulder of the viewer. So she's pressed up against this very small space in this radiator, and she doesn't look like she's really enjoying her meal. She's kind of, again, in that Vermeer-esque way. She's lost in her own thoughts. She's not with anybody. It doesn't look like she's waiting for anybody because there's nothing there. There's not even a meal there. You have this like tempting little bowl of fruit back here, but that's about it. But there's an Automat, but there's no Automat. It's and you get this idea that there's this world of activity behind her. Well, in front of her, she'd be staring over you. So behind us as the viewer. And there's no hint of any of that activity that we saw earlier. This is a completely night and day mood. I love the way he renders this radiator, excuse me. This is something we'll discuss a little later on as well. His infatuation with radiators. Again, he loved to go out and eat, and he loved to people view. I should point out that, and I should have mentioned this earlier, this was the second painting he sold. This broke his drought of paintings. It took him over 10 years, nearly 13 years to sell this painting, and it sold at the Rain Gallery for $1,500. It's in the permanent collection at the Des Moines Arts Center in Iowa. So check it out if you ever get a chance. Fascinating view of the independent single woman in the 1920s having a meal with herself in the evening in one of the busiest fast food chains. It's interesting too when you think the Automat, there's that component of I'm trying to separate myself in this talk from the constant talk of alienation and isolation that you see in these talks about Hopper. We don't know whether she's alienated or for all you know, she's very happy, and we just don't know anything about her at all. Very interesting. But what we do know is that she's from the we're taking the artist's word for it. She's in an automat, one of the busiest chains in the world. And it's strange because it's even less personal because you don't even have an interaction with the people making your food. So odd. You just put the coin in, and there's the food. Then you just move on, and you bring your dish to the tray where you just remove all that. Chop Suey, one of his most famous paintings, one of my favorite paintings. Absolutely beautiful piece. Again, echoes of Vermeer, but only superficially, I'm guessing. It's just you have two females having what seems to be lunch with each other. Interesting too is that there's very little food. There's no food in automats, just her drinking coffee. These two are in a Chinese restaurant. Chop suey, by the way, for those not sure you're aware of this, but it's a Cantonese term. It means like secondhand bits, leftovers. Something that the Chinese chefs would serve to the guailos, as they called them in the West, when the non-Chinese that would come in during the gold rush. And it's interesting that a lot of the Chinese that came over to prospect for gold end up making up their fortune selling, well, opening Chinese restaurants. Chop suey is just well, it became a blanket term for just Chinese food, but that's what the actual word means in Cantonese. Beautiful, beautiful palette. Very few, even the warm tones don't seem like they're earth tones at all. They seem more chromatic, but there's a lot of chroma going on in this painting. The subject matter, two women. And the argument is that they're single from their clothing. Again, the plunging neckline, lots of, she's almost an overdose of cosmetics. A lot of rouge, a lot of lipstick. It's just assumed back then that these were two available women that were having a discussion. No man. There's whatever's going on back here. He seems completely disconnected to, well, at least maybe just, who knows, he's just reading his watch and he's caught at an awkward moment. This painting here was going to be donated to the Seattle Museum by its owner. But when he died, his estate had other plans, and they ended up selling Chop Suey at auction for $92.1 million, I believe, just several years ago. Ed Hopper would be centrifuging in his grave if he found out the amount of money this sold for. But again, it's an absolutely beautiful painting, an intimate painting, mysterious painting. So much to look at and just peruse, which is amazing because, again, there's very little clutter at all. There are not a lot of items. Hopper did not like painting a lot of things in his work. I wanted to show you this interesting painting. If you can see this, it's the bottom. Sorry. I like this painting. It's a strange painting, Table for Ladies. Done in 1926. Remember all that talk about how Joe didn't like to cook and Ed liked to eat. There was also a lot of talk, according to Josephine's diaries that survived, that they had issues with intimacy. Joe was rather well, let's put it, she's not very intimate. And this would be a source of frustration for Edward during the marriage. And he would just go storming outside thinking he can't be intimate with his wife. He can't get anything to eat. So he went outside and he would just walk it off. And this painting is very interesting. There's a lot of psychological talk about it. Table for Ladies. It's on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here you have a view, this oblique angle of, this is not a table, by the way. This is a window display of food. This is a big pane of glass. He's on the outside looking in at all of this horn of plenty, all of this delicious food, nothing that he can gain access to. It looks like a fancy place. So he's not going to be able to eat any of it. So he's got raw meats on ice, tropical fruits, melons. This is, by the way, this is the most food that Edward Hopper paints in any of his catalog. And this voluptuous woman bending over to prepare this. So very, and some would say argue that this was a very suggestive pose, but some people have actually said that this is they took a psychological uh, assessment of it, and the assessment is, and the assumption is that this is a culmination of Edward's culinary and sexual frustration. This was a wishful thinking, so to speak. These two women clearly really just working hard and overoccupied. He's just looking at all this delicious food and this voluptuous woman bending over. There's a bit of cleavage here. Very strange painting. But if you understood Ed Hopper's life, that would make some sense. And of course, the empty table there, meaning that he could be in there, but he can't for whatever reason. It just seems like this is just on the other side of the glass, which is another sort theme that would be echoed in a lot of his work. Looking through windows, looking out at windows, looking at people through windows. Speaking of looking through windows, here's I want leading up to another painting that I just wanted to end this second half portion of the talk on. This etching of a young lady looking at the rooftops along the subway. Very, very common experience for anybody who's ever taken mass transit in New York, especially the subway, and especially in the outer boroughs, is that a lot of these elevated train stations go past windows of residences. Very, very close. I mean, you can actually reach your hand out and touch some of these windows. So here are the rooftops and here are the tops of those windows. And quite often you can't help but look into these windows. And sometimes you catch a glimpse of somebody watching TV or cooking or God knows what, really. But this particular etching is a reflection of that. Beautifully done. Again, these oblique, sharp angles, this diagonal to create motion, which kind of leads me to this. So when Ed would take the subway around the city to this interesting painting, almost looks like a triptych called Night Windows. Similar to that experience, as if you were on a train in the middle of the night, driving past, and you're rumbling past an apartment building. And speaking of voyeurism, I mean, this wasn't intended, but this isn't something he could not have painted this or drawn this from life. It was just, you're just going down the railroad car too fast. But it's a rather interesting painting. Late at night, artificial light inside. This lovely woman bent over. Again, a lot of sexual overtone. I wouldn't say undertones at this point. I mean, let's just say it for what it is. He's just the ultimate voyeuristic scene. She's wearing either a slip or a towel. She's bending over and clearly not aware of what's going on outside or who's viewing what. But it's a warm summer day, one could argue. I mean, the window's open. And again, there's the radiator. A radiator, take your pick. Artificial lighting inside, it almost has a triptych quality to it. This mysterious curtain pattern and the light shines through it. We don't know who this woman is. We can only assume that Josephine was the one who posed. We could take a look at that later on. There's a single bed, again, sparsely furnished apartment. And this is a view at the moment. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's a rather large piece, but I always found it fascinating. And a slice of life for anybody who's ever commuted in New York City and had to go home at night. This is something that a very similar spontaneous experience. I mean, you get the sense this is a railroad car and that the wind shear of the train is what's moving this curtain and making it ripple through. It reminds me of the days I used to live in Brooklyn, and I would have to take the N train along New Utrecht Avenue, and we'd pass through. Once the train would elevate, we'd go very, very close to these apartment buildings along New Utrecht on 62nd Street. And some of them we just look right in and not only see people in there doing whatever they were doing, we can watch people watching TV, and not only that, we can see what they were watching. That's how close we got. And I think this would be a good place to take 5 minutes before we go into the prime of his life and the plateau of his career and the legacy that he left behind. So it's 8:09 now. Let's start up at 8:15. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I will answer them at the end of the talk.
That woman, the second woman,
I don't know what that is. I can't. Whoop.
did they ever do things like this before at Flowerfield?
I don't know. I got the information from Deb. So,
We do lectures every couple of months.
how do we get on the mailing list?
There should be a link on the website for the mailing list.
Thank you.
But watch what we're doing.
Are past lectures available? Have they been recorded?
Yes, they're available on our YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Okay, and we're back for the third installation of this talk, Mr. Hopper's Neighborhood. I put this painting of the pharmacy up. It was again influenced by I don't want to spend too much time with it, but I always thought it was a funny little tongue-in-cheek about Ed Hopper's humor. He has this rather early painting. This was done in the 1920s. He hated clutter, as I mentioned. You see, this is leading to his masterworks later on. But the fact that he would go through all this work to showcase this X-lax sign, which is again to alleviate constipation. Meanwhile, he has this highly cluttered, and some would argue this almost like a compacted colon, but of detail in this display here. And again, as Josephine said in her journal, he was obsessive about clutter. He hated clutter, even in his paintings. So I just thought it was funny. In fact, when this painting was displayed, apparently the drugstore owner did not appreciate that. But luckily, we kept it in the catalog. So there we go. I wanted to say, and here in part 3, we're going to be looking at the height of his career, the height of his fame, and the waning of his fame. What I'm looking at here is an image that I took from Google Maps. I couldn't take the picture when I was in my car a couple of weeks ago when I did a field trip with my students because, we were just moving along and we didn't have a chance. But what we're looking at right now is the corner of, we're on 7th Avenue and 15th Street, and I'm facing east. So there would be, if this building wasn't here, there would be a pretty solid view of the Midtown East Side, the Chrysler Building, and possibly the United Nations, perhaps, even from this angle. And this was the block that was the inspiration for, I should point this out, that these buildings here were clearly were built in the 1930s. This was the original stretch of buildings that were built in the 1860s. Now, it should bear in mind that when Hopper was living in New York, he didn't grow up in New York. He grew up in a quiet, again, port suburb of Nyack in the 1880s. And this was the architecture of the town proper that he was used to. And this string of buildings were built in the 1860s along 7th Avenue and 15th Street. And he knew they were coming down. And he decided to use them as an inspiration to paint one of his most famous works and one of my favorite paintings, Early Sunday Morning. Take a look at this. So these are the original buildings. And again, please don't fall into the trap of saying that he painted these buildings. These were simply inspirations. Hopper, he would get particularly irritated when people made long essays about what his work was about. He really believed that if it could be articulated in words and writing, then there'd be no point in painting it. That was a famous line of his. And in this particular work, he looked at, the city was changing. It was becoming more vertical, and he was not a fan of that. And there was a part of him that was wistful for the old New York and to keep it New York. As I remember, as you recall earlier, I stated that if you were to go on Hopper's images of New York that were preserved, you can swear that there was never a building more than 3 stories tall, and that there were no skyscrapers, and that there were very few people. And you'll notice this famous painting at the MoMA, not the MoMA, the Whitney Museum, Early Sunday Morning, was inspired by that string of buildings that were about to get knocked down. And they ended up getting demolished shortly after he painted this piece. So it was an homage to the old New York that he probably grew up with. So, because bear in mind, at this point, he's in his late 30s. Well, excuse me, no, he's in his late 40s at this point. 1930. So he's on the other side of 40 when he does this painting. And New York is changing rapidly. There's less of the brick and mortar, less of these types of these red stone buildings here, of these short stories and this architecture. Suddenly everything is being built with glass and steel, and everything's going up, up, up. And Edward really didn't want any part of that in his artwork. It's a beautiful painting one of my favorites, and it's really fun to explore when you're at the museum because it's really long. It's 35 by 16 at the Whitney Museum, and you can really fall into it. It's very surreal, and I think if I mentioned earlier, I don't think that Edward Hopper fell into any specific genre. Ed was his own. He was a lone wolf in art. Nobody painted like Ed Hopper. You know, you can't say, "Oh, Ed was doing this," or maybe early on he was dealing with his influences, but he broke away and became his well, the artist that we've come to love. And we look at this piece; it's all horizontal. Everything is attributing going left and right, left and right. The very few attributes going vertical. Okay, the barber pole. I should point out too, he did Spies that somebody called this Early Sunday Morning. The original title was Early Morning. And he said that words matter. When you give it Early Sunday Morning, then you're tightening the narrative. Yeah, of course it's early Sunday morning. Nobody's outside. But what Edward was trying to do is point out that it was early morning, whether it was Sunday or Saturday or Monday, words do matter. When you say thank God it's Friday, it has a very different connotation than when you say thank God it's Monday, right? So when you said early Sunday morning, it kind of it heaped a narrative on there that he felt wasn't fair. And well, please forgive that over there. I don't know what that looks like, a blemish from this slide. Interesting piece in that there's nobody on 7th Avenue. And bear in mind, this is New York City. The population of New York at the time was, even back then, 1.6 million people. That comes out to 55,000 people per square mile. So it's very few places in New York where you get to see this kind of desolation, even on a Sunday morning. It's interesting too, you see these venues, everything's locked off. There's like an entire world that's closed off on the other side. We don't know who's behind these businesses. We don't even know if they're open, where they're opening. Early Sunday morning implies that these things are going to be closed for the day. And again, this was something, it was a source of irritation for him. So these buildings were eventually knocked down. The buildings that inspired this painting were knocked down. Interesting, if you look, the hydrant is still there, which I think is pretty neat, providing that this was the view facing east. You'll notice that there's very little homage to skyscrapers at all. This is 1930. New York is starting to change. Edward is trying to keep it in his mind and in his heart a certain way. He grew up with a specific type of New York, and it's what he holds dear. You might notice this big block here. There's a lot of talk about that. While these buildings were being knocked down, there was another building that was being built. So this is what stands there now. This was the apartment building, and I believe these are apartments that went straight up into the sky. And Edward wanted no part of celebrating that. So if you look, it's just one big looming black shadow that is impeding on these more humble brick and mortar structures. And this was a cause of concern for Hopper in his career, because he was very concerned about how there were more and more of these buildings going vertical, and that ultimately they would block out his view and block out the sun of his studio. Moving right along here. Okay. What's that? Pivotal date, November 1st, December 7th, 1933. That is 11 West 55th Street, West 53rd Street. This is the MoMA. This picture was taken in 1930. It is still standing. It is the Museum of Modern Art. This is where Ed Hopper's career is reaching the pinnacle. He has a solo show there during the month, a retrospective of his work, 25 paintings and a handful of etchings and watercolors, and it is a huge success. And he is at the height of his fame. Bear in mind that at this point, he has lots of collectors, again, helped facilitated by Josephine, his wife, and he is on the up and up as one of the most unique and dynamic artists of the day. The catalog is still available. You can see it online. I wanted to show you, before we go into the more popular works, I just wanted to show you this quick piece. So as as illustrated here, 55th Street was just a short subway ride away from Washington Square, which is 55th Street's a couple of miles north to this building. It's very interesting that this building it looked space age even in 1930, and the structure still stands. There's been some renovations since, but there have been a number of paintings that went into the exhibit and have never left the MoMA. So if you ever go to the Museum of Modern Art, you're able to see some of those beautiful Ed Hopper paintings. He still maintained this sensibility. A very odd thing about Hopper was his aversion to the grandiose. I mean, again, he didn't paint the Brooklyn Bridge. He didn't paint the George Washington Bridge. A lot of the famous bridges he steered clear of. The Manhattan Bridge, he did a handful of those, and that was about it. Here's a painting he did, and it's a very rare one that makes the rounds in Hopper talks, called the McCombs Dam Bridge. It's way farther up north. This is the Harlem River that connects the East River. So very close to, well, right across the way here is the Bronx. The one bridge that he seems to spend the time doing this 2-point perspective detail on is this rather humble bridge. It still stands. A very odd, this is a very odd composition in that it's again, it's almost forcing the verticality. There's Bronx on the other side. There's this clutter of buildings over here. But one of the things that's completely removed at this time in 1935, the big showstopper on the other side of the McCombs Dam Bridge from this perspective is the biggest shrine to baseball, which is Yankee Stadium, which at the time still stood as it was the house that Ruth built, home of the New York Yankees, and the largest stadium for baseball in the world, and it was right behind here, and Ed just completely removed it. He has no interest in it. Ed had no interest in sports. He had no interest in celebrating large edifices. He was still, even now, interested in exploring the intimate. Right here, again, not a single person anywhere on this bridge, no cars. There may be a hint of a human being here tending the drawbridge. And what's interesting about this particular drawbridge is that McCombs Dam Bridge it's a swinging bridge. It doesn't go up like two hands in prayer that you're used to, that kind of elevate and they split apart. The McCombs Dam Bridge, it rotates on an axis and turns 90 degrees, which he must have found fast. So it still stays low. And then it'll let the traffic pass, and then it connects, and then it rotates back. But yeah, this was the bridge, and the trolley would take you across to Yankee Stadium. And over his shoulder, behind him, would be the Polo Grounds, which was the rival New York Giants venue, New York baseball Giants. So again, an aversion from the grandiose and an exaltation of the intimate and the quiet and the mysterious. So the next time you're stuck on the what is it, the Harlem River Drive? Nope, it would be the FDR Drive. Heading north to Yankee Stadium, take a look at this vantage point while you're stuck in traffic trying to cut across to get to the stadium. And this is what Ed Hopper saw. But I wanted to show you this very rare, mature painting. So this is in the 1930s. I wanted to share this painting with you because I just found it unusually odd and very non-Hopper-esque. I've discovered this painting a couple of years ago, and I'm not entirely sure if I like it. Ed Hopper makes an attempt, and this looks like, because his paintings tend to be so static, and there's very little activity. But in this case, he's trying to capture motion. He did enjoy riding horses when he was summering in the Hamptons, and if he headed back home to Nyack, he did enjoy horses. This looks like a self-portrait. There's Ed, extremely large guy. You can tell he's just so big on that horse. The horse looks almost very uncomfortable, but it's very strange. This is the bridle path on the west side of Central Park. He eliminates a lot of the greenery and the color. It's almost like it's early spring or late fall where there's just not a lot going on. But again, I wanted to show this to you because I just thought it was a very weird. Very little of it echoes Hopper. So he does this experiment where he tries to capture not just motion, but dynamic motion. And I don't want to, I really want to criticize the painting too much, but you get the sense that these horses are like merry-go-round horses. And so this was an attempt on his part to convey motion. There are a lot of things I like about it. There's also the mystery here of where this is, because this is again a composite of experiences, like all the other paintings that he did. There's nothing that you can pin down. So we know this is the West Side, and for those of you familiar with the West Side, you might notice this building back here, and that is the Dakota, the former home of the late John Lennon, the present home of Yoko Ono, and the stage was set there in the setting for the famous horror movie Rosemary's Baby, for our horror buffs that are in the crowd. So this is 72nd Street. Central Park West is on the other side, and this is the parallel. If this is there at all, I'm not sure if this even lines up properly. I think this is the bridle path that leads. Yeah, it goes underneath 72nd Street. It's just a strange painting, but I'll leave it to you whether you like it or not. Some of you that take tours of New York, take walks on the west side of the village, you might notice this building, this rather brutal Langone Health building now. But prior to this construction that was done in the 1950s, used to be part of St. Vincent's Hospital on 7th Avenue. If you go up a few blocks away, you might notice this is the building we were talking about in early Sunday morning, up the block here. I could be mistaken here. That could be a little farther back. But same neighborhood, just walking down 7th Avenue South, turn this corner facing north. The Langone building used to be the home of the Lowe's Sheridan Theater, which is one of Edward Hopper's famous places to visit, where he was inspired to create one of his magnum opuses, New York Movie. One of my favorite paintings by him. Just such drastic use of light and color. Again, it might as well be a single figure in the entire image. She's this young female usher, attractive, young, capturing, stuck in her own thoughts. Some people argue that this was again an amalgam of theaters like the Lunt Fontaine and the Ziegfeld Theater plus the Sheridan, because there are images of both. They're characteristics of all those movie theaters here. But it's almost like he's broken this down into these specific ratios of rectangles. It's a very, very vertical component to this painting. You got two separate light sources. Very, very strange. As warm as that yellow is, it seems like a cool refrigerator light. It's not very flattering, is it? I love this beautiful attempt here. The way he conveys this pattern on the rug, and it's repeated throughout as it goes up to the balcony or mezzanine. And then you have a separate light source here. These dimmed lights here under the balcony with this handful of people in the audience watching a film, obviously. We don't know what the movie is. We don't know what she's thinking. She's clearly not on her cell phone. They didn't have them back then. So she had to think about something else or do something else at the time while everything was going on in the movie theater. But she's clearly an usher. That's her uniform. And she tended to the moviegoers on the other side. It's strange. There's a lot of surrealistic lighting here. It seems almost too bright under here. The lights coming from left to right and hitting this wall and creating that effect. I find it fascinating. It's one of my favorite paintings. And every now and then it's at the Whitney. It's not always on display, but when they do have an Ed Hopper display there, it's just fantastic. And if you ever get a chance to get over there to the Whitney Museum of Art to see the Hoppers that are there. So as you walk down from the movie theater, which is right around here, and you work your way, there's 7th Avenue. It's actually the same block. So the Sheridan Theater would be right here. Ed wrote in his notes that he had an infatuation with wedge-shaped blocks, where these triangular blocks where buildings were just kind of met at a point. So we took this little field trip tour with my fellows a couple of weeks ago, and I drove right up this street just to show them, well, a couple of spots that were inspiring Ed. So this is Washington Square Park. So this was only just a 5 or 10 minute walk from where he lives. And if you walk up Greenwich Avenue, you'll hit all of these streets along the way here. And this specific corner here is believed to be the source of inspiration for what some consider as magnum opus. So there's the 7th, this is Greenwich Avenue, there's that street there, right? This 11th Street. It was a number of places. There's a Crawford Lunch that also met. This might be another building along the way, because there is more than one wedge-shaped building. That's the corner now, the West Village Florist on 7th Avenue South. Oh, and you can see it right there. There's the Langone Health Center, and that's where the Sheridan Theater was. So if you ever take the walk up Greenwich Avenue, you'll see pretty much what Mr. Hopper was looking at when he was getting all this inspiration. And so along with this and his other life's experience, he would come up with what we consider his magnum opus piece, Nighthawks. Lots said about this piece. It's presently at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's in their permanent collection. Again, this drastic, the subject matter is just so bizarre, so surreal. Some would argue that, well, this is almost like a fever dream of earlier works. It's a compendium of everything that Ed held dear in art into this one piece. The subject matter, very vague, very uneasy. You've got 4 figures. Some argue that this figure may be this figure here, might be the same character. Some say that's a self-portrait. Everybody seems to be disengaged in this diner. And again, you'll notice nobody seems to eat in any of Hopper's paintings. There's that one, the table for ladies painting where there was tons of food, but nobody was eating there either. But everyone just has a cup of coffee. Some argue that this is a self-portrait of him while he's tending to these figures. This couple here, rather disconnected, but we're not entirely sure whether they're speaking or not, right? The lighting is strange. There is no door in or out of the diner. It's almost like you're looking through a lit fish tank. We don't know what they're thinking. He had a very interesting way of conveying New York as being for a city that had 1.6 million people, it could be one of the most loneliest places to live. And this is where, there's echoes of early Sunday morning over here. Some might argue that he took that row of buildings and set them across the street and used that storefront for this. But yes, this corner, well, we know specifically whether this corner or not was the inspiration, but it definitely did play a role in his composing this. And I always found this a very interesting window too. If you know anything about glass making, this is a highly expensive piece of glass to get that custom bend. And you might notice echoes from his earlier works. This is a far cry from, this fellow reading the newspaper in Washington Square. You can almost overlap this onto this piece. You get in the same harsh, let's get this 2-point perspective here. You got one vanishing point going off here, and then you've got this road, the street going off on this angle, creates all of this compositional tension. There's motion here. And that's what happens when you're dealing with stark angles in your compositions, is that when you create oblique angles, it removes the static properties of the painting. This is a far cry from early Sunday morning, or in his case, he called it early morning. Not sure who called it Sunday, but again, it wasn't something he was pleased with. But think about where he went. So when he did this was in 1942. Edward was 60 years old by the time he did this. This is a far cry from this painting here that he says was the progenitor of that painting. Consider this the most important painting in his early development. Everything's an amalgam of them. Very, very fascinating. He had I'm trying to find the quote where he explains how you see kernels, words to the effect of, from very early on, when you look at works of his going back to his 3rd grade report card, you still see images of him in there now, later on. Now, I wanted to throw this in here only because I thought this was an awkward painting, and it's just so strange to add to the awkwardness. This is a late one he did 7 years later, probably the same models, conference at night, very surreal, very uneasy painting. 3 people in an office with a highly surreal light source. Can't make heads or tails of why anything at night would create that sharp light. Even the fullest moon in the city wouldn't be able to cast that much light into this very stark offices. Very sparsely furnished. You've got 2 books that we don't know what they're discussing. It all seems very tense, very strange. Middle of the night. This dark corner, what's behind there? What is the light source here? Who can only imagine what could create that much light during a night conference? But it almost looks like these are the same players that were in this room, and she put on a different wig. But what are they talking about? What can be so important that they're in this room in the middle of the night where there's no interior light source anywhere? Everything's lit from outside. I used to think this was impossible lighting until one day I was spending the night at a friend's house who lived on the West Side Highway near Riverside. And the first night I tried to sleep in this apartment on the West Side, I couldn't because there was a glaring billboard for the New York Yellow Pages. For those who remember, there's a big yellow billboard that was lit up and just shining right into the apartment. And there were no shades. And it was just getting blasted with this light. So it kind of reminds me of that a little bit. But yeah, another awkward, tense moment. So here they are interacting, but we don't know what they could possibly be discussing. Is this a detective? Are they employees? Are they relatives? Again, you look at Hopper's work, you get more questions than answers. Later on, I wanted to show you this. Ed starts to go on the decline. His health starts to wane. He starts to lose his popularity starts to wane as well. The abstract expressionists are starting to make way, and they're looking at Edward, and as his old hat. A lot of critics accuse Hopper of not developing his style, not evolving his style, but Ed was just still beating to his own drum. And when you look at this painting in 1962, and again, we're winding down here. This is a far cry from the other pieces. Here's the depiction of this woman is very, very unique. She's very, very scantily dressed office with a low cut and a low collar, just very appealing, young, attractive, seems to be very self-assertive. Echoes of Automat with the light here, right? The surreal sunlight. It's blast, almost like, I don't know, it's like the sun just got twice as close to the earth in this picture. She's on the other side, unattainable, independent, again, sparsely lit office, doing her thing, but this is a very, very different woman. So this is 1962. Hopper at this point is in his 80s. And think about this painting and think about how far he's removed from this painting. Very different woman at this point, different age, different generation. How many generations have passed since this painting was made? I mean, 40 years removed from this sale. And you can see that it's come a long way, and Ed's cataloging that. And there's again a lot of mystery here, right? There's no cars, there's no people, there's nobody in these. None of these offices are lit. It might as well be a Sunday morning in downtown Manhattan with all the offices closed. Fascinating stuff. And then I wanted to show you this last painting just to show you. Ed did make his way over uptown a little bit. I think this was one of his later paintings. Again, his health was declining, and it shows in a way a lot of his surrealist tilts. This is sunlight on the brownstones. This is depicting a young couple. I suspect he's wistful for those days at this point, because at this point he's in his 80s or very close to his 80s. These brownstones are facing this rather arbitrary, mysterious light source facing south. That's Central Park West, by the way. That's Central Park. You'll notice it is, again, completely devoid of people, revelers, and it's devoid of any skyscrapers on the other side. Again, this is, I feel in a lot of ways, Edward painted this from a nostalgic angle. This was the city that he grew up with. This was the city that he misses. This is the city that he thought it ought to be. And this is how he kind of sees himself and Josephine later on. They're just both not talking to each other, but they seem to be engaged in whatever the light source is. And some can argue from a poetic standpoint that they're reaching the twilight of their life at this point, and things are winding down because, well, come 1967, he would go against the medical advice and demand to he was brought back to his apartment where he would die. Lived there over 50 years, and Josephine, his wife, would live just less than a year later. So Edward he was just shy of his 85th birthday, and Josephine, I think she cleared her 85th. And I think this is a good place to wind down. I'd like to thank you for joining the talk. I hope you found that insightful, and if you have any questions, I am available to answer them. Let's see, I'm looking at the chat here. Show chat previews. Okay. The breakup, I call it the breakup. Mr. Brenner. The one in which the view according to its eye contact occurs. Which painting was that referring to?
The breakup, the automatic painting, the woman sitting alone.
Could be. Could be. There's just he just leaves so much open. I just find that so I just find it so mysterious. And that's a good answer. She's just so somber, just by herself, completely oblivious to this world that's going on behind the viewer's shoulder. Is that Josie Lapico from Emo? Don't know. Kim Burkhart, YouTube, Atelier at Flowerfield. Building in the background might express his distaste for the vertically and transform. Yes, there is. He was very clear about that. Yes, and there are past lectures available from other artists that we were talking about. We talk about Vermeer, and there is that parallel. But again, it's there's a lot that they don't have in common. And yeah, I agree. And when you look at that painting that I have behind this, again, it's a pseudo self-portrait. It's called I think it was called Office in a Small City. He just kind of looks over and he distills the city in his own special way. It's more akin to Chirico than it is to, say, I don't know, Stella, right? It's just it's so stark and empty. And you look at that watercolor that he did, it's just gives you that hint that he's just, again, for a man that loved the city, he was a very shy, quiet, introverted fellow. It was very interesting. Excellent presentation. Thank you, Richard. It's not only the New York settings that disengage evident. Yeah, I there's a lot with the Cape Cod in Paris. I just wanted to keep it within the island of Manhattan. There's just so much work. One day we may explore that. Mary Daniels, did you teach art at East Mauritius? No, I didn't. Am I mistaken for someone else? I did teach briefly Long Island Academy of Fine Art. I helped in Riverhead, but not there. Thank you. Very informative and thorough. There was an exhibition at the Whitney. Do you know if Nighthawks was loaned to them in that exhibition? There are so many exhibitions at the Whitney Museum. I can't begin to tell you which one. There's a good chance that they lend it. Yeah, a lot of Hopper's works, they make the rounds. There are a lot of them. We're very fortunate. One of the things I should point out is after Hopper died, Josephine Nivison donated the remaining works, hundreds of works, to the Whitney, which is in their private collection now. She also donated a lot of her own works. And regrettably, they didn't take much care of the works that she donated. They kept all of Hopper's works. But there is a revival of Josephine's works. And it's something to explore. And I know that there's a couple of retrospectives of her work as well, and she played a huge role in his development and his popularity, and that was the cross she bared when she was with him. I hope that I hope you, does anybody have any other questions? I hope you enjoyed that.
Do you know if he was influenced at all by the noir writers?
By the who?
By some of the noir writers like Raim and Chandler?
He was
Because
a heavy reader. I wouldn't be surprised at all. He was an avid, his father, he inherited that from his dad. He was very bookish. And he was more connected to modern writers than modern painters. He just had a stronger connection to him. And I think that came from his father. He just loved books. He didn't keep a lot of books around, but there was a really good library, the Jefferson Market Library that he frequented. It's still there if you ever get a chance. It gives me a new appreciation of Greenwich Village when I walk through there. And if you get a chance, you can actually make your way over to the Ed Hopper studio. It's just I've been having a hard time getting anybody to let me in during the weekends. You can do it by appointment. I'm not sure who to reach out to these days, but it's open during the weekdays. It's it's the social work office, so it's open to the public. But it's fascinating that you can actually walk in there and see that he lived a very humble, frugal life. It was quite telling to see that huge easel, and then him and Joe, his wife, would actually share that studio for a while, at least until 1938. But yeah, I was it's something to explore. Anybody else? I guess that'll conclude this talk tonight. Yeah, I just wanted to keep it local as best I could, keep it on the island of Manhattan. And it says, again, one of the challenges of doing a talk about Hopper is he was so prolific. It's very easy to just get saturated with the work. So I wanted to keep it, I wanted to show some rare works. I wanted to show some of his magnum opuses and show a chronological evolution. I think we owe him that much. We tend to consolidate an artist's body of work as one singular piece and expression. And as time went on, he started to change. His subjects started to change. And well, the times changed with him. So I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed giving it. And if you have any questions, you can reach me at the Atelier at Flowerfield. And I think what we'll do is we'll close out this, we'll conclude on this. Does anyone else have a question?